we will continue with our first panel discussion, titled CRISES in Israel. Let me introduce our speakers, Jonathan Magyeri, Dr. Gábor Balázs, and Menahem Keren-Kratz. The first panel will be moderated by Professor Jeffrey Kaplan. I ask you all to join the table.
First panel, please. All right, our first panel is titled Israel and Crisis. And it was a panel that obviously was planned before October 7th, when the Israeli crisis seemed to be purely internal. No Jewish polity has lasted more than 75 years, and by chance, Israel is 75 years old this year. So it looked to many intellectuals looking from the outside, and many from the inside as well, that Israel as a state was in serious trouble. And some of the conflicts that have been alluded to in the welcoming speeches took very much center stage. The judicial reforms, which were largely Ashkenazi, and Western Ashkenazi, not Russian Ashkenazi, which is very important. There were conflicts between the religious and the secular, the Ashkenazi and the Mizrahi. There were conflicts with the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, who are against everybody. There were conflicts between religious Zionists and others, and there were conflicts between settlers and those within Israel itself. So until October 7th brought, at least temporarily, the Jewish community, the Israeli national community, together, it looked very much like it would fall apart. And these are the questions we want to look at as an introduction to what followed later. I'll ask our speakers to keep their comments to about 15 minutes, because I'd like to have as much possibility for questions and interaction with the audience as possible. Mr. Jonathan Magyeri, who is the editor-in-chief of the always fascinating Neocon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for your gracious invitation. I cannot pretend to be here prior to the 7th of October, so therefore, most of what I'm going to say is based on the horrific events that have taken place on that very sad Shabbat, on that very sad holiday of Simchat Torah and Shmini Atzeret. So, also trying to keep it short and to the point, I'd like to speak about 6 lies, 6 statements of untruth that is very popular surrounding this conflict and the conflict beforehand, and as a matter of fact, the whole Israeli-Palestinian situation in general. All right, so not in order of importance, but perhaps one of the lies that's perpetrated by mainstream media and also by so-called experts is the fact that Hamas terrorists are freedom fighters. That they're fighting for some sort of a cause, for the cause of the Palestinian people, for the cause of the liberty of the Palestinian people, and that is just not true. Not true because Hamas itself is perhaps the largest or the biggest tyrant over the Palestinian people. When it comes to the misuse, to use a euphemistic term, the misuse of the support, the financial aid that the Palestinians have received in Gaza in the past almost 2 decades, ever since Hamas took control 17 years ago. And that is just a reminder that this aid that mostly have been generously given by the European Union and European countries exceed the amount that the entire Europe has received after the Second World War in something that was called the Marshall Plan. the fact that the aids were stolen are just a financial matter, let's say, but using the Palestinians, and we see that is happening while we, sit in this comfortable conference hall, that we see that Palestinian civilians are used as human shields to protect Hamas leadership and Hamas terrorists is just another sign of Hamas not having in mind perhaps the interest of the Palestinian people. The second lie, I believe, that has to be told, that in Gaza there is the Hamas as a terrorist organization, and there are terrorists, whereas there are civilian population that is completely separated from this terrorist organization. That is not true. Number one, Hamas have not just come to power on its own. Hamas has won an election. Perhaps it was not the most democratic election in 2006, but nevertheless it was an election, and have come into power in 2006, elected by the people of Gaza, as opposed to the PLO, which was the representative organization of the Palestinian people till then. Also, it is very hard to distinguish between terrorists today in Gaza. I myself have been in that area only last week, for a few days, and I was told by various soldiers and military personnel that one of the hardest things is to distinguish between a terrorist and a civilian, since they are dressed the same way. They're not well recognizable because they're just not a conventional army. Lie number 3: Israel's response is not proportionate. This is perhaps the hottest potato. Israel's proportionate response. Israel is being accused of killing civilians deliberately or deliberately, but nevertheless killing. And numbers have gotten out that the Palestinian casualties since this operation have started exceeds 10,000 Palestinians. Even if you believe those numbers that have been supplied by Hamas, which is again a terrorist organization, nevertheless, it's very hard to distinguish between. It's very hard to put a number on what should be called a proportional response. If proportional response means that Israel should have gotten into Gaza and kill blatantly 1,300 Gazans, children, women, elderly, that would have been a proportional response, perhaps, because that's the amount of people that were killed by the Hamas terrorists on October the 7th, and that is obviously absurd. Also, it would have been absurd for Israel to kill or to eliminate the proportional number of Palestinians that have been given over by the state of Israel some 10 years ago in return of Gilad Shalit, an Israeli soldier that's been captive in Gaza for a number of years. Israel has handed over 1,027 Palestinians in return in exchange to Gilad Shalit. Obviously, 1,300 multiplied by 1,027, you would arrive to a crazy number of Palestinians, because according to that equation, perhaps that's how much one Jewish life is worth compared to one Palestinian life. That's obviously absurd. Number 3, also, it's hard to say that there is such a thing as proportional response in a war. I don't need to remind you, in the histories of war, there has never been a proportional response on the table, as it's absurd to even talk about something. If Israel needs to achieve its goal, which is to eradicate Hamas and to wipe it off the face of the earth, then it has to do whatever it takes to achieve that goal. If it does not achieve that goal, even one Palestinian life lost is a tragedy, because goal has not been achieved and one life has been lost. So that's as far as the proportionate response is concerned. Lie number 3, that there is unity among the Palestinians. Hamas is very popular, not just in Gaza. In Gaza, according to the latest polls, Hamas has a support of some exceeding 25% of the total population. And just to remind you that about a half a year ago, when the last survey was conducted, Hamas support only was about 65%. So since the war, the support for Hamas has grown instead of being lower. And pardon me, it used to be 65, now it's 75% support for Hamas. And Hamas is also very popular in the West Bank, in what we call Yehuda v'Shomron, in the West Bank. Just yesterday, there was a viral, a video that went viral, showing one Palestinian prisoner who was given back by Israel in exchange to the hostage deal that has taken place a few days ago. And as she was arriving to the West Bank, she was cheered, and Hamas flags were waved in the West Bank. Also, there was another video where you have seen that in the West Bank, two Palestinians were killed or lynched and hanged on a barbed wire fence with their arms cut off and being spat at by Palestinians who were accused to be traitors spying for Israel. So Hamas is not a Gazan phenomena. Hamas is a very phenomena in the West Bank as well as in Gaza, perhaps not to the same extent, nevertheless. Line number 5, Palestinian cause is supported by all Arab states. That is just not true. You could see that by the amount of Palestinian refugees who have seeking refuge from Gaza through the southern border that was opened for a little while by Egypt. But very early on in this war, both Egypt and Jordan, the two major players, or the two neighboring countries to Israel and Gaza, have said very clearly that they're not interested in having any Palestinian refugees, just like they were not interested in absorbing any Palestinian refugees prior to this date. Since 1949, basically, Palestinian refugees are not welcome. Also, another fact that supports the fact, fact that supports the issue of Arab states not being interested in the Palestinian problem so much is the Abraham Accords that have been started a few years ago and flourishing. And by the grace of God, those countries who are participating in the Abraham Accords, as well as Saudi Arabia, that has been, or which is in talks with Israel to extend the Abraham Accords, have clearly said that they're not interested in stopping those conversations and discussions, and they're interested in proceeding with the negotiations. And last but not least, perhaps the most important question that is on everyone's mind: what will happen after this conflict is over and before the next one starts? To be perhaps more realistic than pessimistic, but what will happen? Whether a two-state solution would solve the Palestinian problem, and it seems that the answer is towards the negative with each passing day. I don't need to remind you that Israel has extended a peaceful hand, or landed a peaceful hand towards the Palestinians, all in all, at least 6 times, or the nations of the world have offered a two-state solution, stretching back even before the establishment of the State of Israel to 1936 with the Peel Commission's plan, but also after in 1948 by the United Nations, or the predecessor of the United Nations, and so on and so forth, all the way following up to Ehud Barak's and Olmert's very gracious and very, I would say, not pro-Israel peace offers, as well as the Trump administration's latest peace offer that has been perhaps the most detailed and most realistic peace offer on the table ever yet. The two-state solution or any two states would mean, just to remind you, an Arab state that would be Judenrein, that would be free of any Jews. There would be not one single Jew living in a Palestinian state, just like there was no Jew living in Gaza, which was de facto a Palestinian state since 2006. and there would still be 2 million Arabs living in a Jewish state. And I'm not saying that there is a problem, just stating it as a fact, that there would be a Palestinian state without any Jews, and there would be a Jewish state with many, many Arabs and counting. Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, this in microcosm was the story of this conference, that October 7th did rather take over the agenda in many ways. Our next speaker is Dr. Gabor Balash, Associate Professor and Historian from the Jewish Theological Seminary. Dr. Balash.
When Theodor Herzl gave the title Der Judenstaat to his magnum opus, I'm sure that he didn't realize that in this title lay one of the greatest dilemma of the future state of Israel. About the German word Judenstaat, one is unable to decide whether it is an adjectival construction, meaning Jewish state, or a possessive construction, meaning the state of the Jews. The difference between the possible translations is crucial. Should the main characteristic of the state of Israel be that the majority of its citizens are Jews, but the state itself be a neutral entity? Or does der Judenstaat mean that the state itself should have inherently Jewish characteristics and that the official institutions of the state should reflect the culture, religion, history, tradition of the Jewish people? This dilemma has been a topical issue since the writing of Herzl's book and just became sharper since the establishment of the State of Israel. The answer to this question affects one of the most important decisions about Israel's identity. Nowadays, there is a broad consensus that Israel should be a Jewish and democratic state, but the appropriate relationship between these two components is far from being consensual. Nor is there a consensus on what we mean by the terms democracy and Jewish. Although after October 7, everything changed. And it seems almost unbelievable that 2 months ago, the judicial overhaul seemed to be one of the most serious crises in Israel's existence. We almost forget that tens of thousands of people were demonstrating week after week against the planned reform. If we are to be optimistic, and we hope that in a few months' time, Israel will win the war against this despicable terrorist organization, Hamas, then we also have to think about it, that it's very likely that sooner or later, Israel will have to face the judicial crisis again. And that's why I think it's important to speak about the causes and the significance of it. What I would like to show is that the concepts of democracy and the concept of Jewishness are inseparable in Israel. People who sincerely claim to be committed to the values of democracy think that the proposed judicial reform will endanger Israeli democracy. Others, who are also very pro-democracy, argue that it is the current operating principles of the Israeli Supreme Court that pose a threat to Israel's existence as a Jewish democracy. Through a few texts, I will try to illustrate some of the salient elements of the debate and illustrate the underlying interpretations of Jewishness and democracy. Many people in the world have the impression that the Israeli judicial crisis began when the recent government of Israel, barely a month after its formation, submitted 2 packages to reform the Israeli Supreme Court. In fact, the current attempt of a judicial counter-revolution was preceded by the judicial revolution of the 1980s and the 1990s. The judicial revolution began in the 1980s when the court abolished 2 key restrictions on its own power to hear cases. First was standing, meaning who is entitled to petition the court, and justiciability, meaning what issues are within the court's authority. Then, in the second phase of this revolution, in 1992, the Knesset approved 2 basic laws. And that time, everybody in Israel was expecting them to be treated like all the previous basic laws, namely that they might be a part of a future constitution, but they are definitely not an existing constitution, since Israel has no constitution. The Knesset had no intention to regard these 2 laws as an actual constitution, but as came out, the Supreme Court and the leader of the Supreme Court did have this intention. The chairman of the Knesset Legal Committee explicitly told to the members of the committee that these new basic laws would not empower the court to nullify other laws. We can also see that no one was aware that anybody would regard these laws as an actual constitution, from the very fact that more than half of the members of the Knesset didn't bother showing up for the votes. When Israeli members of Knesset understand that a vote is important, almost the whole house turns out. But the basic law, human dignity and liberty, passed by a vote of 32 to 21, which means that a little more than a quarter of the members of the Knesset voted for it. And it's an interesting fun fact that the Likud was on power and the prime minister was Yitzhak Shamir at that time. So I'm convinced that it is a very reasonable defense of democracy not to regard these laws that passed under the above circumstances as constitutional legislation. And still, the Israeli Supreme Court considers these laws as if they were the constitution of the state. The main ideologue and driving force behind this judicial revolution was Aharon Barak, the president of the Supreme Court between 1995 and 2006. He has a very characteristic legal virtue, and I will quote from his essay written in 1992. So it's Barak speaking. In my eyes, the world is filled with law. Every human behavior is subject to a legal norm. Even when certain type of activities, such as friendship or subjective thought, is ruled by the autonomy of the individual will, this autonomy exists because it is recognized by the law. Wherever there are living human beings, law is there. There are no areas in life which are outside of law. End of quotation. As Hillel Nair, and among others, noted already in 1996, the problems begin in the theoretical realm, with the presumption that the world is filled with law. Whoever is versed in Jewish sources, this expression should sound like a religious text. Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzvaot Maleh Kol Haaretz Kevodo, from Isaiah. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of armies. His presence fills the earth. It seems that for Barak, what fills the world is not God's glory, but the law of the land. Indeed, when Barak applicates the law to every human behavior, including subjective thoughts, it can easily remind us a description of some conception of a religious system, let us say some understandings of the Orthodox halakha, but definitely not a democratic legal system. There are many other ways to analyze Barak's judicial revolution and his conception of judicial activism, but today I will focus only on one aspect, the understanding of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state in the thinking of Barak and his school. Barak tried to balance these two values, but not so surprisingly, in a manner which matched his beliefs about their relative significance. In a lecture he delivered at Haifa University, less than 2 months after the basic laws went into effect, he pointed the way to a synthesis. The content, it's a quotation again, the content of the phrase Jewish state will be determined by the level of abstraction which shall be given it. In my opinion, one should give this phrase meaning on a high level of abstraction, which will unite all members of society and find the common among them. The level of abstraction should be so high until it becomes identical to the democratic nature of state. The state is Jewish, not in a halachic religious sense, but in the sense that Jews have the right to immigrate to it, and their national experience is the experience of the state. So, this solution of Barak essentially can be called as legal alchemy, the transformation of the term Jewish into a synonym for the term democratic. If we want to have a clear understanding of what Barak considers Jewish values, in the same speech, Barak gave a list of us what is the positive meaning of the term Jewish. Again, a quotation. The basic values of Judaism are the basic values of the state. I mean, the values of love of man, the sanctity of life, social justice, doing what is good and just, protecting human dignity, the rule of law over the legislator, and the like values Judaism bequeathed to the whole world. End of quotation. No one would dispute that these values are indeed Jewish values. It is, however, highly debatable that it is justified to single out only these Jewish values, which are otherwise no more Jewish than they are Christian, or even secular, universal human values. So one of the greatest experts of Mishpat Ivri, the Jewish civil law, the Supreme Judge Menachem Elon, criticized Barak for his synthesis. I'm citing Elon. One may wonder, how can it be that there is an entirely different standing for each of the two expressions contained in the same statute and in the same clause, Jewish and democratic, when both of them come to describe the same thing, the character of the state of Israel? How can it be that the expression democratic, which by the way appears second after the expression Jewish, is to be given its full meaning and is to be interpreted according to the decisions and literature that was written on the subject inside and outside Israel? Yet, the expression Jewish must be abstracted of all independent and original meaning, to be regarded as an artificial attachment that is subordinate to the concept of democracy. End of quote. If we want to examine how Barak creates harmony between democracy and Jewishness, it turns out that the mixture is heavily democratic and very hardly Jewish. Barak cites dozens of Canadian, American, Western cases, statutes, laws when he elaborates on the basic laws, but he almost never turns to the Jewish source. By virtually excluding Jewish sources from the legal system of the state, Barak is essentially redefining Israel's values, and he is not reflecting to them. It is worthwhile to have a closer look on how Barak deals with the so-called legal hard cases, when a judge must exercise judicial discretion to choose among a number of lawful options when all of them are lawful. In this context, Aaron Barak refers to the enlightened community. Barak himself says that this enlightened community is not a real community at all, but a metaphoric representation of a certain set of values. Still, Barak's critics say that the enlightened community is very recognizable by the postal zip code, social affiliation, and party loyalty. The enlightened community is built up from people who identify with values of universalism and progressivism, and they will unfailingly direct the judge towards the defense of individual rights and equality, values which Israel shares with the democratic non-Jewish states around the world, and it will never direct them towards what could be a unique demand of a Jewish state. Especially telling is Barak's reference to an enlightened community that is, and this his words, neither Jewish nor a non-Jewish community, which means that Jewishness is irrelevant. Aaron Barak's approach to the balancing of values goes like this. When there is a conflict of values, an enlightened judge must try to find a synthesis between democratic and Jewish systems. But if this fails, then universalistic democratic values prevail. The result is that a Barak-inspired court gives the sense to the Israeli citizens committed to the traditional Jewish values that Israel is becoming less and less a Jewish state. The combination of Barak's judicial activism with the creative abstraction of Jewish values led to the regular review of Knesset statutes by the Supreme Court. Barak himself proudly declared, quote, "If up until now judges were given conventional weapons to deal with the legislation by way of interpretation and the creation of Israeli common law, now judges have been given non-conventional weapons which allow nullification of legislation which does not observe the basic law's criteria." There is an important technicality too, and with the words of Evelyn Gordon, adding insult to injury, Israel's court can overturn laws far more easily than any other courts in other democracies. In most democracies, only a majority of the full court can overturn laws because decisions by the people's elected representatives shouldn't be overturned lightly. In Israel, at least in theory, any 3 of the 15 justices can hear such cases, meaning laws can be, in principle, be overturned by a vote of 2-1. Moreover, since cases are never heard by the full court, the chief judge can effectively determine the outcome of any case by choosing which justices will hear it. So, when we think about the judicial crisis of Israel, it is important not to simplify it to the claim that we can hear a lot, that the planned reforms are against Israeli democracy, unless one thinks that the only way to democracy is that 15 liberal judges can virtually overturn any law of the parliament. Of course, it is fully legitimate to criticize the details of the reform suggestions, but it is also very justified from the point of view of democracy to criticize the details of the existing legal reality of Israel, especially if we remember that today's reality is not a given in Israel, but a relatively new, revolutionary creation of the last few decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Menachem Karen Kratz, who has been with us, I think now 3 times in our various conferences, will take over from Bar Ilan University. Please.
That's my presentation.
You have a PowerPoint, right?
Yeah.
You're up. I'll just watch it.
Okay. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank Jeffrey and the Danube Institute for inviting me. Actually, I think from now on I'll be the first one to speak about the original topic, which is the relationship between Orthodox Jews and Christians in Israel. And I'll be speaking about it quite rapidly in order to touch the basic points. So let's begin with the obvious. Jesus was born a Jew. He was born in the autonomous Jewish state, which was under Roman rule at the time. He lived in the 1st century and became a significant spiritual leader among Jews, practically. The first Christians were in fact Jews, which followed the teachings of Jesus, and the establishment of Christianity as a separate religion was only happened in the 3rd century in Rome with the establishment of the Catholic Church. Unlike Judaism, the disciples of Jesus, including the apostles, sought to spread Christianity among non-believers, unlike the Jewish tradition, which keeps Jews to themselves and do not seek to promote Judaism to other people. The first organized missions to the Jews and to other people were an integral part of the Catholic Church. They started in the 3rd century and continue to operate all around the world and are still operating till today. Christianity in general regarded Palestine the Holy Land and sought to protect its holy places, which were, of course, the most ancient places to Christianity. However, Christians only ruled Palestine for a relatively short time, if you consider the last 2,000 years since the birth of Jesus. They controlled Palestine through the Roman and the Byzantine time till the 7th century. Then during the Crusade time, which was relatively a short period of 150 years, and later most of the Jewish people live in Christian countries, mostly, of course, in Europe. That was frequently, the Jews were frequently subjected to all sorts of violence, including persecution, discrimination, harassment, expulsion, blood labors, inquisition, pogroms, etc., etc. Along these offenses, Jews were also targeted by Christian missions which sought to convert them. This led eventually to the fundamental fear and hate on behalf of the Jews, European Jews mainly, toward Christians in general. As to the topic of Orthodox Judaism, the use of the originally Christian term orthodoxy with respect to Judaism began in the first half of the 19th century in Central Europe. This term actually referred to Jews who, despite a growing trend of modernization and secularization, adhered to the centuries-old tradition, particularly the strict observance of the mitzvot, the religious commands. Orthodox Jews nowadays, or in the last 2 centuries, can be divided into 2 major groups: religious Zionists and ultra-Orthodox. Each of these groups has a strong mainstream group, but also a radical wing. There are 2 different radical wings. The religious Zionist radical wing is the Hilltop Youth and the Temple Mount faithful, and the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox society, radical wing is named the Eda Haredit and Neturei Karta. So we have 2 Orthodox groups, and 2 groups have radical wings. Now that we understand the basic structure, we can go and deal with the subject ahead. Christians in Israel. Today, there are about 180,000 Christians living in Israel. Some 80% of them are Arab Christians, meaning that the rest of them are European Christians who live or reside in Israel in all sorts of religious institutions. Christians consist some 2% of Israel population and some 7% of the Arab population in Israel. These numbers have fallen dramatically from the time during which Israel was established in 1948. Then Christians were 22%, and in 1970 the Christians were 5%, and the reason for the drop in percentage is not the drop in the number of Christians, but the large waves of immigration of Jews from other countries, particularly lately from the USSR, and also because of low fertility rate among Christians. 25% of the Christians live in the big cities, such as Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa, and Nazareth, of course, but most Christians, over 70%, live in big villages, Arab villages. All Christian citizens have full civil rights. As a group, as a distinct group, they are the most educated group among Israelis. Some of them volunteer, as we have heard, to serve in the military, in the Israeli army. And the highest ranking Christian is a colonel who is still in active duty. In Israel, there are 10 recognized churches, denomination, which enjoy a full religious autonomy, meaning they have their own courts, which are authorized to run all sorts of official ceremonies, to make official marriages, to register new births, etc. And like all other religious groups in Israel, they are also funded by the government, each according to the size of its community. Israeli Christians are represented in the Knesset. Usually in each Knesset, which has 120 members, there are between 2 and 4 Christians representing the Arab community. There are 2 in the history of the Israeli Supreme Court, in which there were in total 80 Supreme judges. There were 2 Christians serving as Chief Justice, compared, for example, with only 1 Haredi judge. So in that sense, they are even more successful than the Haredim. A relationship between Orthodox Jews and Christians. Basically, because of Christian belief in the Holy Trinity and in the first coming of Jesus as a Messiah, Orthodox Jews regard Christians as Gentiles and heretics who denounce the fundamentals of Judaism, of a single God, not a Trinity, and the idea of a future Mashiach, a Messiah, not a Messiah which have already revealed himself. Considering the long history of Christian persecution and violence on the one hand, and the endless attempt on the part of Christians to convert the Jews on the other hand, Orthodox Jews have a primordial fear of Christians that goes on throughout history in Europe and in other countries. And this fear were exacerbated in Palestine and in Israel by 2 major facts. First, that when the first Jews immigrated and started arriving in Israel in larger quantities, I mean, I'm still speaking about thousands at that time in the 19th century, already the missions started operating in Palestine, in the land of Israel, in order to try to convert them to Christianity, which Jews represented or appreciated as unfair try on behalf of the Christians. And the attempts of missions to convert Jews in Israel continues to this day in enormous numbers and enormous funds that are funneled towards this mission. Second, it's not just the ideological aspect, but also the practical aspect. because German Christians who lived in Israel, some of them, the German group also joined the Nazi movement, and there were swastikas hang up in Jerusalem. They were planning on how to massacre the Jews once the German army will conquer Palestine. So there was a real fear among the Jews in Palestine from the Christians. And also, with respect to the Arab Christians, they were very nationalistic, and they also spoke harshly against the Jewish state and against Jews. So the fear was not just ideological, but it was also a fear for their life, which eventually led all Jews, but particularly Orthodox Jews, who conceived the attempt to try to change the nature, the religious nature of the country, as an offense on their own identity. So, after understanding the basic ideas, we can now start talking about anti-Christian activities on behalf of Orthodox Jews. And I have to emphasize that we are talking about a very marginal phenomenon. It was very difficult for me to collect the incidents that we are talking about because it's really a marginal phenomenon. Usually, most Jews, including most Orthodox Jews, accepted the fact that in Israel there is a Christian community, either European or Arab, and there was no will on behalf of the Orthodox Jews to confront the Christians unless they felt that the Christian community provoked them mainly in the way of the activity of the missions, which targeted Jews in general and Orthodox Jews in particular. So we see that since the 19th century, there were the Orthodox Jews active against in response to the activities of the Christian missions in Israel, which sought to lure the Jews, the poor Jews, to convert, using the fact that they were destitute, and when they needed hospital, instead of paying to a Jewish hospital, they were the missionary hospital, which offered cure for free, or they offered work, or they offer all sorts of benefits to Jews in order to attract them and eventually to convert them, to which the Orthodox Jews responded with a contra action against those missions. This continues to this day. There is a massive activity of Christian missions in Israel to this day, and I can tell you from my own experience that every couple of months, on average, I get to my own post box in my private home a leaflet, Christian leaflet, calling me to convert, giving me information, telling me about the life of Jesus and how Jews should become aware of the action of Jesus, and how wonderful it would be for me as a Jew to accept Jesus. And professionally speaking, I'm also in contact with such missionary organizations to understand their motives and the way that they operate. And I'm telling you, this is ongoing activity that never ceases, all the time. There is also an objection on behalf of Orthodox Jews to the activities of Christians who settle in Israel and either established their own settlements in various places. There are several such settlements in Israel, either by Christians who are coming from different countries, such as Yad HaShmona. This is a village next to Jerusalem, which was established by Finnish Christians who settled in Israel, and they are also promoting, of course, missionary activity. And they have, for example, a hotel, a very nice hotel in the village, and people are coming to spend their vacation there. And while they are having the vacation in that hotel, the local people, those Finnish people and descendants, of course, now it's the second, third generation, they are trying to influence them, to know more about the most important Jewish figure, namely Jesus. So we have that. We have in Dimona, we have a group of American Christians who are black people who immigrated to Israel and have settled there, and they settled there for several years. So there is an objection towards their existence there, and especially towards the actions, the missionary actions. There were also protests, which now no longer exist, against Christian pilgrims who came to Israel, and they used to visit also the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods, and there was a response to that by way of protest, but this only took a short while, and after a couple of years this phenomenon ceased. There is also activities among the more radical groups of Orthodox Jews toward mainstream Orthodox relationship with Christians visiting Israel. In these pictures, we see, for example, various popes or other clergy who are visiting Israel, and they are meeting either with Israeli officials and even with Israel chief rabbis in way of courtesy. But the most radical Orthodox Jews are objecting to that, saying that that should not happen, and Israel as a Jewish state should not recognize the fact that Christians are in fact invited to visit Israel. So this is to show you that the mainstream of Orthodox Jews, either the ultra-Orthodox Haredim, but also religious Zionism, welcoming visiting Christians, top official of the Christian churches, the more radical elements are condemning that and acting against that. And another example, which also took a relatively short while, was the objection to the establishment of the Mormon University of Mount Scopus, which happened some 30 years ago, because the Mormons are known, one of the main fundamental beliefs is the missionary activity, and there was a big objection of them establishing such a big establishment in Jerusalem, and only after the Mormon Church agreed and signed an agreement that it would not allow the people to act in missionary activity in Israel, they were given the permission to establish this university, and there are many students. I mean, this place is having like thousands of students each year coming from mainly from the United States, but they are not engaged they have committed not to engage in missionary activity, but until then they were protest against the establishment of this institution. I want to say now a few things about the ongoing so-called phenomenon of attacks against the Christians in the 21st century, especially in the last few years. I think that calling this a phenomenon is an overly exaggeration. There are very limited number of such incidents, and the fact that we even know about them is due to the fact that there are so little example of that, and each of that examples is being reported by the press. And the perpetrators of these acts are not people from the mainstream of the Orthodox community. Usually we're speaking about youngsters who have just recently converted, or not converted, but recently repented and became Haredi. So they are not sure about their own identity as Orthodox Jews, and they think that if they will do like those radical acts, then there will be some affirmative action on the community. But the fact is that this is condemned by everybody, either from the all communities. It is condemned by the government. It is condemned by the chief rabbis. It's condemned by the ultra-Orthodox rabbis. So indeed, calling those incidents a phenomenon is an overly exaggeration. And the fact is that, as I mentioned, it does not happen in the vacuum, because we know about those incidents because there are only a few of them. And we should consider the fact that activities against religious institutions around the world, and in Israel in particular, is a growing trend. Yes, we never hear about the attacks being made by Israeli citizens, either Jews or non-Jews, against synagogues, because there are so many of them. I mean, there are hundreds of attacks on synagogues in Israel by Israeli citizens, but this never, or almost never, reaches the news, because there are so many incidents happening on a daily basis. I can tell you from my own experience that in my own synagogue, the synagogue of which I'm a member of, and in which I pray from time to time, someone, probably a Jew, decided to put a head of a pig at the gate of the synagogue as a sign of protest against Orthodox Jews. You ask me if someone was captured. There was not even a police investigation in this case. So there are incidents like that happening every day. I mean, Torah scroll being touched. They are breaking into a synagogue. There are swastikas painted on the doors of synagogue. So it's not something. I mean, we are looking with a magnifying glass on those incidents because they are against Christians. But this is a general phenomenon on behalf of, I don't know who is doing that, but it's not something which is done only against Christians. It is done against other religious institutions as well. And at the same time, as I've also mentioned before, Orthodox Jews and Jews in general also consider the activities of the Christian missions also an offense on their beliefs, on their way of life, and the fact that Christian missions are allowed to operate freely in Israel, and there is no way of stopping them. This is also a sort of, I'm not saying it's a justification of those acts, but this is not something which happens in a vacuum. I mean, the attacks are going from both sides. That's what I'm saying. It's not a justification, but it's an explanation why people might be less tolerant toward other religions when one religion does not respect the other the same way that it should have been. But to sum up everything, Israel has hundreds. The last time I've counted, there are over 500 Christian institutions in Israel. In Jerusalem alone, there are over 200 Christian institutions, including churches, theological seminaries, monasteries, all sorts of small operations, including the missions. And from early childhood, I don't know, lucky, but it so happened that I have visited most of them in Jerusalem, and I have a good connection with some of the leaders. And most of those institutions are supported financially by the government, are protected by the Israeli police when there's information that something bad is going to happen there. The police also have to intervene when there are incidents in between Christians in those institutions. And a lot of those places also serve as tourist attractions for Jews and tourists. And all of the places that you can see here, also some of them have like music festivals. Some of the monasteries produce wine and other food products. So on a normal Sabbath, there are a lot of people going to visit those places. They're open to everybody, and there is really not much problems as the press wishes us to believe there is. In order to just say a few words about Christians in the Palestinian Authority, I just want to bring a few figures. First of all, when we're speaking about the Palestinian Authority, we're speaking about the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel conquered several Arab territories, including Gaza, Judea, and Samaria. Sorry, there's a mistake here. In the 1970s, Christians constituted some 5% of the Arab population in those areas, and under Israeli rule, Christians were protected. Since the Oslo Accords in 1993, Palestinians, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, took control over the large cities in those territories where most of the Christians lived. Following the rise of Muslim fundamentalism in the Palestinian Authority, many Christians emigrated to other countries. Today, there are less than 50,000 Christians in the Palestinian Authority territories, which is only 1% of the Arab population. Remember, there are 7%, there are 2% of the Israeli population in general. But in the Palestinian Authority, with everybody is Arab, there are just 1% of Christians. And what's happening in Gaza is even worse. After the Hamas takeover in Gaza in 2006, over 90% of the Christians fled, and today they are merely 0.1% of the population, namely of the 2 million, roughly 2 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip. There are roughly 2,000 Christians, and the condition is getting worse every day. Just to finish up with a personal note, I was born and raised in Jerusalem, and for me the presence of Christians in my city was obvious. Yes. This is a drawing I made as a youngster from a place not far from my home, in which you can see the skyline, the elements of Christianity are obvious, they are nice. This later on happened to be a place which I've frequented because I had friends who were studying at this establishment, which is a German theological school in Jerusalem. I was there a frequent visitor. In the back you see the Dor Mitzion church after the Virgin Mary. And this is how I envisioned Jerusalem as a child in my mind, which Christianity was an obvious fact. Also, the opening picture in which you can see an Orthodox Jew and a Christian monk. This is from my own art collection, which shows you that my interest in this topic didn't start in preparation for this conference, but many, many years beforehand. Thank you very much.
Working? Yes. Thank you, Menach. That is an almost perfect bridge into the next panel, and it's really good. I have two questions. We have only about 10 minutes, but I would like to hold those because I can always ask them later. If somebody in the audience has a question, I would give over to them. Please.
Hello. My name's Robert Greenfield. I'm Australian American, just moved to Budapest. I'm acutely aware of the history here of the Jews and the Holocaust in Budapest. In Sydney, we live next to a Hasidic community. In Brooklyn, my son lives next to a Hasidic community. So those live side by side. We never have any issues whatsoever in those areas. What I'm hearing today is that Israel has a lot of issues, never mind October 7th, has a lot of issues ranging from the Supreme Court, which is it going to be a Jewish democracy, or is it more of a democracy with a Jewish overlay? My view is this: if you look at the challenges here, and there is a question in here. My view is this: is that secularism has mollified and toned down a lot of the disputes between the three Abrahamic religions, which are the most aggressive, the two being Muslim and Christian, maybe not the Jewish religion as much, is not the answer to be more secularist and less extreme as you talk about all of the various elements, whether they are Muslims, where they're pushed out the Christians. There's a lot of history of that over the last 25 years. We all get it. Or the challenges that you have inside Israel. Thank you.
So as I understand, the question is, would it be better, is secularity the answer? I think it's basically the...
I'm asking about is secularism a better approach than having more and more focus on religion?
Okay.
Well, when I spoke about orthodoxy, I mentioned that orthodoxy is divided into two groups, and each group has its mainstream, but it also has its radical wing. Okay? However, when we are speaking about non-Orthodox Jews, and particularly when we are speaking about secular Jews, we should also realize that secularism also has a mainstream, secularism, but it also has a radical wing, which acts pretty much in the same manner as the religious radical. I mean, it's more active, it's more aggressive in its actions, and this is basically the battle between the ends. It's not the confrontation between secular and Orthodox Jews. I'm not speaking right now about other religious groups. Is not so much a battle between the mainstream representative of these groups, but a battle between the more radical elements in those camps, because the mainstream are willing to compromise. The radicals are radicals because they are not willing to compromise, and the unwillingness to compromise is characteristic both on the end of the Orthodox, either the ultra-Orthodox on the one hand, or the religious Zionist, more radical groups on the one hand, but also on the radical end of the secular Jewish group who are pretty much against Israel being any sort of a Jewish state in any religious state, in any religious sense. So this is mainly the battle. So battle between the radicals is more prevalent.
I'm an Orthodox Jew, a rabbi also, so I think I'm pretty radical compared to a secular Jew. I very much agree with Dr. Karim Katz, but also you have to understand that the current crisis in the Middle East, as it has always been, and somehow the West failed to recognize that, is it's spoken about in many different forums, but it cannot be overstated how important it is that it's not just a territorial conflict, but it's also a religious conflict, and more a religious conflict than a territorial one. In Israel, because the society, by and large, until the last few years, perhaps the last decade or so, has been mostly secular, and since the Israeli policymakers, governments, and whatnot have been mostly comprised of secular Jews, somehow they thought, and I believe wrongly, that the current conflict could be solved by a secular logic. I think reality knocked on the door on October 7th and has waken up that part of the Israeli society that did not want to, and I emphasize did not want to, not because they did not, they could not, they did not want to recognize this reality. I completely agree with the fact that that the war, so to say, between the three Abrahamic religions are, if there's any war between Jews and Christians that I'm unaware of, I don't know about any war. But if any fraction between religious groups is mostly on the radical side, say, of each, the proportion or the percentage of the radicals within the Muslim community cannot be compared to the proportion of the radicals in the Christian or the Jewish religion, because fundamentals within Judaism, within Jewry, within world Jewry in general, are very few in number, as just like percentage of fundamental Christians in. And when I say fundamental, I mean violently fundamental. Not because fundamental to their belief, because I don't find it a problem that you're strongly holding on to your convictions. That should not be a problem, right? The problem is whether you want to force your convictions on me. That's the problem. So those and Judaism, as we said, as Roy Oberlander pointed out, and Dr. Balash has pointed out, Judaism was not a proselytizing religion ever, and it's still not a proselytizing religion. So, but putting that aside, nevertheless, the violent parts are, as we have seen from this beautiful presentation, that the violent parts in both Judaism and Christianity, at least today, is very, very few in number, which is not the case in the Muslim community, unfortunately.
Do we have another? Otherwise, I'll finish up with a deeply professorial question, which would drive all of you to the break, I believe. Here's the deeply professorial question. In Israel, there have been two views that have been promulgated and have become very well known. One is, as you say, much more secular and Western, and one is much more Orthodox and religious. The one, David Ben-Gurion, for example, going back to Herzl, as a matter of fact, that the Israel will one day be a state like any other. And when he said that, he meant Western states, Western, democratic, and the unspoken part was deeply Ashkenazi, I believe. The other is, I think, best articulated by Rabbi Zvi Yehuda Kook and many others, that Israel is not like the Western world. Israel is religious, holy, unique, and like being a people apart, it should be a nation apart, and thus a light unto the nations at a distance. Which of those views do you think will be the future of Israel after the Gaza conflict? That's my deeply professorial question.
I'm a scholar and I learn text. I have no idea about the future. So if I was a prophet, then I could tell. But getting back to Ben-Gurion, when they reached the famous status quo agreement with the ultra-Orthodox Jewry, we know today that they could agree because Ben-Gurion told to the radical secularist members of his government that don't worry that we make a compromise with the Orthodox, because in 20 years there are not going to be any Orthodox. And the Chazon Ish, when he was also agreeing to this compromise, he told the other rabbis in Bnei Brak that don't worry about this, because in 20 years, all of them are going to be Orthodox. So sometimes it really helps in getting to a compromise when you don't see reality as it is. And telling the truth, I don't think we have any idea what's going to be after the war with Hamas.
If I may, just... I am also not a prophet, but looking at tendencies and demographics, the professor has talked about the judicial reform and the crisis that followed, a little less about the crisis that followed and the division in the state of Israel that followed this judicial reform, which was also a crisis about demographics. The protests were about demographics. The matter of the fact is that the Chazon Ish, who Professor Balash has just mentioned, was a real chazon. Chazon means a visionary. Because in a way, the state of Israel, perhaps in a slower pace than he wanted to, but the state of Israel today is more religious and even more observant, if you could divide these two terms, perhaps even more observant than it used to be. There's a growing number of religious people just by the fact that there are more children born in religious households, coupled by the fact that there's a tshuva, there's a return movement within the secular Jewish population also, and there's aliyah, there's more incoming immigrants to Israel who come because of religious convictions. So everybody talks about Orthodox majority by 2050. Perhaps there are some who already foresee for 2035. And we're talking 10, 15 years, perhaps 20 years, perhaps 25 years, that there will be a majority of Orthodox Jews in the state of Israel. So which one of the visionaries were right, whether Ben-Gurion or the Chazon Ish, or whether Rav Kook, or Theodor Herzl, or Ben-Gurion, whoever you quoted, I believe that which is going to cause its problems. There's going to be problems. There's going to be problems with diaspora relations. There's going to be problems within the Israeli society. There's going to be movement away from the state of Israel and part of the seculars. Perhaps, who knows? But, and we're talking, by the way, we're talking a massive increase in demographics, a massive increase in number of people. Everybody talks about 20, 30 million people in the state of Israel in the in the upcoming decades. So I think that's very, very interesting to follow, and it has a very significant effect on politics and both domestic and regional.
So my colleagues are not prophets, so I'm going to take that role upon myself. And my prophecy relies on facts. And I'll give you a few numbers to consider. When Israel was established and it had its first elections, the Orthodox Jews decided to unite their forces and to establish a united Orthodox party, which was composed of the four prominent parties in Israel, two Haredi parties, also Orthodox, and two religious Zionist parties. And those parties together got 16 votes out of 16 seats out of 120. Namely, they were basically 15% of the population, assuming that the voting for the Knesset represents roughly the proportion in population. Today, these numbers are much, much higher than they've been in the past, and they are higher by a factor of over 50 or 60 or 70%, depends on each election campaign. So when Israel was established, the common sociological theory was the secularization theory, which expected as the world will become more modern, then people will leave religion in order to live a secular life. But this prophecy never happened, and people still, I don't know why, but continue to have the irrational and unscientific beliefs in the Creator. And so this trend is what's going on in Israel right now. And those numbers are in a growing trend with every conflict that Israel faces. And that happened after the Six-Day War. It happened after the Yom Kippur War. It happened, the growing number of people who embrace Judaism as a religion. They're repentant, they're joining, and they're starting practicing Judaism as a religion. And I expect that this current war would also result in a rise of Orthodox Jews in Israel. Add to that the issues of the fertility rates and other issues. So basically, if we're speaking about the situation in Israel and the internal conflict in Israel, which is sometimes described as the conflict between the Israelis and the Jews, then in that sense, the Israeli Jews are winning, and they'll probably continue to do so in the next couple of decades. And as I told you before, if you want to know more accurate details, ask me in 14 years' time, I'll tell you exactly what happened.
As we said last night, 40 years from now, we will talk about this again, and we will have answers. Thank you all very much, and thank you very much to the panel. It was a very good way to open the conference.